I have a statement that was inspired by Winston Churchill. IRR is the worst form of private equity performance measurement, except for all the others that have been used. IRR is horrible. It can be manipulated. It is time-based. Private equity firms find ways to inflate IRR so that they can raise additional funds and receive higher performance fees. But it's the best we got. What are the other options? There's MOIC, multiple on invested capital, and TVPI, total value to paid-in capital, which gives us a multiple on the money we invested. But it ignores the time period. This is helpful in conjunction with IRR, but it's not better. Think of it. Doubling your money in 1 year is very different than doubling your money in 20 years. There's DPI, distributed to paid-in capital. This is another multiple-based metric that is usually used in the middle of the fund's life. DPI is based on the actual capital distributions to the investor divided by the capital paid into the funds by the investor. Funds have been using NAV loans to distribute capital faster to the investor, which has made this metric less reliable. We cover NAV loans later in this video. And there's PME, the public market equivalent, which is more academic in nature and not used much in industry. It gives a comparison of the private market to the public market, but it has many issues and academics argue on the appropriate benchmark to use. So it looks like we're stuck with IRR for now, but that's okay because if you fully understand IRR, then you know the right questions to ask. And don't worry, we're here to help. In this video, we go deeper into IRR and give you a couple questions to ask private equity funds during your due diligence about IRR. We will review the time sensitivity of IRR. Then we will talk about subscription lines of credit. And then we'll talk about NAV loans. And we'll end the video with a final thought. So let's get started with the time sensitivity of IRR. To fully explain the time sensitivity of IRR, we'll need to show you an example using a calculation for IRR, internal rate of return, and MOIC, multiple on invested capital. So let's say an investor invests $50 million and receives $100 million back in 1 year. Well, the investor will have doubled their money or received a 2 times multiple on invested capital, or MOIC, and a 100% internal rate of return, or IRR. Now let's extend this example for 2 years. Let's say the investor invests $50 million and 2 years later receives $100 million back. The investor will still have doubled their money or received the 2 times multiple on invested capital, MOIC, but the internal rate of return, the IRR, will now be 41%. So as you can see from our example, if it was possible to shorten the time frame of when the capital was invested by the investor to when the capital was distributed to the investor, well, a fund could report a larger IRR. Private equity funds have been using subscription lines of credit and NAV loans to reduce the time frame from when the capital was invested by the investor to when the capital was distributed to the investor. So don't go anywhere. We're about to cover those topics in this video. So let's move on to subscription lines of credit. To fully understand subscription lines of credit, well, we will use an extreme example. Let's say that a private equity fund invested in a company at time 0 for $50 million and sold the investment at time 2 for $100 million. If the private equity fund called capital from the investor at time 0 right away and sold the company in 2 years and gave the money directly back to the investor, well, the IRR would be 41%. Now, let's say that the private equity fund uses a subscription line of credit And instead of calling the capital from the investor at time zero to buy the company for $50 million, the private equity fund would borrow the $50 million from the bank through a subscription line of credit to invest in the company at time zero. At time one, the private equity fund would then call the capital from the investor, not put the money in the company because the company is already purchased, but use that money to pay back the bank. Let's ignore interest just for this example. Now, let's make the assumption, like we did in the first example, the company was sold at time two for $100 million. In this case, if IRR is calculated from time one to time two, time one representing when the capital was called from the investor, the IRR would be 100% because technically the money was only invested for 1 year. So with the use of a subscription line of credit, in this extreme example, IRR was 100% instead of 41%. Now, not all private equity firms will calculate IRR in this way. So if you're an investor in a private equity fund that has a subscription line of credit, please make sure you ask the question to the private equity fund, can I please see IRR with and without the subscription line of credit? It's all about knowing what questions to ask. So let's move on to NAV loans. Subscription lines of credit that we just spoke about use the investor commitments to the private equity fund as collateral. Well, NAV loans, or net asset value loans, use the net asset value of the companies in the private equity fund's portfolio as collateral. After a private equity fund buys companies, it can return capital to an investor without selling the companies. And you can probably guess how. The private equity fund will borrow against the portfolio assets and will distribute the money to the investor. And sometimes the investor may not be aware that the distributions are coming from NAV facilities due to the lack of transparency in the industry. NAV facilities allow for private equity funds to distribute capital to investors early. This not only inflates IRR, since the time period is shorter, but it also inflates DPI, distributed to paid-in capital, as we mentioned earlier. Also of note, these distributions that are given through NAV loans can be recallable. Currently, as of early 2024, the disclosure of usage of NAV loans by GPs to LPs is not industry-wide practice. And so investors, if you are looking to invest in a private equity fund, don't forget to ask the fund if they use NAV facilities and, if so, how they use them. Now, here's a final thought. IRR is a time-based metric that can be manipulated. It's the worst metric that we have in the industry, well, except for all the others. But it's not the actual metric that should be blamed for how it's calculated. Investors, if you're going to invest in private equity funds, know what questions to ask. Ask about subscription lines of credit, ask about NAV loans, and make sure you understand how the answers you get from your questions will impact the calculation of IRR.